Jordan Myers stood at the edge of her frost-covered backyard, the bitter December wind slicing through her coat as she stared at the old oak tree where she and her brother Mason used to carve their initials as kids. At 35, Jordan had built her life around the unshakable belief that family was the one constant in a chaotic world. Her parents' annual winter gathering, a tradition spanning decades, was more than just a holiday event. It was the heartbeat of their bond, a reminder of shared laughter, late-night stories by the fireplace, and the warmth of belonging. But today, that belief lay shattered at her feet like broken glass, jagged and impossible to piece back together. She clutched the crumpled letter in her gloved hand, the words still burning in her mind. Her parents, with their gentle, apologetic tone, had written to explain that this year's gathering would be different. They wouldn't be expecting her. The decision they claimed wasn't personal, just a matter of space, of keeping things manageable. But Jordan knew better. The real reason hid behind those careful words, and it bore her brother Mason's signature. He had always been the persuasive one, the golden child who could bend their parents' will with a smile and a well-timed plea. She could almost hear his voice, smooth and calculated, convincing them that excluding her was for the best, that she wouldn't mind, that she'd understand. The betrayal stung deeper than the cold, cutting into the very foundation of what she thought family meant. Jordan's breath fogged in the air as she paced her boots, crunching against the thin layer of snow. How could Mason do this? They'd had their disagreements over the years, petty arguments over money, old grudges about who'd been favored growing up, but nothing that warranted this kind of exclusion. She'd spent months looking forward to the gathering, imagining the familiar scent of her mother's cinnamon bread, her father's off-key carols, and the way the house seemed to glow with memories. Now those images felt like a cruel mirage slipping through her fingers. Was family loyalty just a hollow promise, something to be discarded when it became inconvenient? The question gnawed at her, twisting her anger into something sharper, something that demanded answers. She stopped pacing, her gaze hardening as she looked toward the horizon where her parents' house sat, miles away. This wasn't the end of it. Mason might think he'd won, that he could erase her from their shared history with a few whispered words. But Jordan wasn't one to fade quietly. She'd confront him face to face and unearth the truth behind his betrayal. Whatever it took, she'd reclaim her place in the family or expose the cracks in its foundation for all to see. The winter gathering was still a week away, and Jordan knew the storm brewing inside her would only grow stronger with each passing day. She tucked the letter into her pocket, her resolve as unyielding as the frozen ground beneath her feet. If loyalty meant nothing to Mason, she'd show him what it meant to her, even if it meant tearing down everything they'd built together. Jordan Myers had always believed that family was the blueprint of her life, a structure she could rely on, no matter how turbulent the world became. Growing up in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Seattle, she and her younger brother Mason had shared a childhood filled with the kind of small, indelible moments that seemed to define happiness. Their home was a modest two-story with a sloping roof and a backyard that stretched into a patch of woods, a place where they'd built forts out of sticks and dreamed up grand adventures. Jordan, 2 years older, had often taken on the role of protector, guiding Mason through scraped knees and schoolyard squabbles with a fierce, unspoken loyalty. Their parents, both teachers, had instilled in them a deep reverence for togetherness, weaving traditions into the fabric of their lives like threads in a sturdy quilt. As an adult, Jordan had carved out a successful career as an architect in Seattle, her designs gracing the city's skyline with a quiet elegance that mirrored her own reserved nature. At 35, she lived in a sleek, modern home perched on a hill overlooking Lake Washington, a space she'd crafted with meticulous care. Her life was a testament to structure and order, each decision a calculated step toward stability. But beneath the polished surface, her heart remained tethered to the messy, imperfect warmth of family. That's why 3 years ago, when Mason's fledgling tech startup crumbled under the weight of bad investments and worse timing, Jordan hadn't hesitated to open her doors to him. He'd shown up on her doorstep, his usual confidence replaced by a hollow look in his eyes, His partner Dylan trailing behind with a duffel bag and an awkward smile, Jordan had waved away their apologies and ushered them into her guest suite, a spacious lower level with its own entrance and a view of the water. She'd insisted they stay rent-free until they got back on their feet, brushing off their promises to repay her, as if money could ever measure what family meant. Mason had always been the charmer of the two, with a quick wit and a grin that could disarm anyone growing up. He'd been the one to coax their parents into extra dessert or a later bedtime, while Jordan, more serious and introspective, had often watched from the sidelines with a mix of admiration and exasperation. But after the failure of his business, that charm seemed to dim, replaced by a quiet bitterness that Jordan couldn't quite reach. Dylan, a soft-spoken graphic designer with a knack for diffusing tension, tried to keep the peace, but even he couldn't mask the strain that began to settle over their shared space. At first, Jordan hadn't minded the late-night conversations drifting up through the floorboards or the clutter of takeout containers in the kitchen. She told herself it was temporary, a small sacrifice for the brother she'd always protected. But as months turned into a year and then two, the arrangement began to chafe. Mason and Dylan made little effort to find their own place, their gratitude thinning into something that felt more like entitlement. Jordan found herself biting back irritation when she'd come home to find her meticulously organized pantry raided or her utility bills creeping higher without so much as a mention of contribution. The annual family traditions, though, had remained her anchor through it all. Every December, the Myers family retreated to a rustic cabin in the Cascade Mountains, a weathered hideaway their grandparents had bought decades ago. It was a sacred ritual, a week of unplugging from the world to focus on each other. They'd haul in firewood, cook hearty meals on an ancient stove, and play board games until the early hours, their laughter echoing off the pine-paneled walls. Jordan cherished the cabin retreat more than any other tradition, even more than the winter gathering at her parents' house. It was where she felt most connected to her roots, where the weight of adult life seemed to lift, if only for a few days. She'd always imagined Mason felt the same, picturing the way they'd race to claim the best bunk beds as kids, or sneak out to stargaze on the frozen lake nearby. Even in recent years, with tension simmering beneath the surface, the cabin had been a neutral ground, a place where they could pretend everything was still as it used to be. But pretending had become harder. As time wore on, Jordan began to notice the subtle ways Mason took advantage of her generosity, not just in her home, but in the way he leaned on her for emotional and financial support, without ever acknowledging the burden. He'd borrow money for emergencies that suspiciously coincided with new gadgets or weekend trips with Dylan, promising to pay her back once his next big idea took off. Dylan, for his part, seemed uncomfortable with the dynamic, but rarely spoke up, his quiet demeanor a shield against confrontation. Jordan tried to keep her frustration in check, reminding herself that family meant weathering the storms together. Yet each unreturned favor, each casual dismissal of her boundaries, chipped away at the foundation of their bond. She'd catch herself staring out her office window, sketching blueprints for buildings she'd never build, her mind wandering to the question of whether Mason even saw her as a sister anymore, or just a safety net. The resentment grew quietly like frost creeping over a window pane until it obscured the warmth that had once defined their relationship. Jordan couldn't pinpoint the exact moment things shifted, but she felt it in the silences that stretched too long during their conversations, in the way Mason avoided her gaze when she asked about his plans to move out. She'd lie awake at night, the hum of the city outside her window, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her, wondering if she'd been naive to think family could withstand anything. Had she been too, giving too quick to sacrifice her own needs for his, or was this just who Mason had become, a man so caught up in his own struggles that he couldn't see the cost to those around him? The cabin retreat, once a symbol of unity, began to feel like a test of endurance last year. Mason had arrived late, blaming traffic, though Jordan suspected he'd simply prioritized a last-minute meeting over family time. Dylan had tried to smooth things over with a sheepish apology, but the gesture felt hollow. Jordan had forced a smile, helping her mother with the cooking while her father stoked the fire. But the familiar comfort of the ritual was tainted by a nagging sense of unfairness. Why was she always the one to bend, to accommodate, to forgive? She'd watched Mason laugh with their parents, his charm effortlessly winning them over as it always did, and felt a pang of something she couldn't name. Jealousy, perhaps, or the bitter realization that her sacrifices went unseen. Now standing in her frostbitten backyard with that devastating letter in her pocket, the weight of those unspoken tensions pressed down on her like a physical force. The exclusion from this year's winter gathering wasn't just a slight, it was the culmination of years of imbalance. Of giving more than she received, Jordan's mind drifted back to the cabin, to the countless memories etched into its walls, and wondered if Mason had ever truly valued them as she did. Had he been whispering doubts into their parents' ears for months, painting her as the problem, the one who didn't fit anymore, or had her own silence? Her refusal to confront him sooner allowed this rift to grow unchecked. Her breath clouded in the icy air as she clenched her fists, the cold seeping into her bones, but failing to numb the fire inside her. The cabin retreat was still months away, but the winter gathering loomed just days ahead, a deadline for the confrontation she knew she couldn't avoid. Jordan had built her life on the belief that family was worth fighting for, but now she questioned whether that fight would save them or shatter them completely. Whatever. The outcome, she wouldn't let Mason rewrite their history without a reckoning. She turned back toward her house, the silhouette of the oak tree, a stark reminder of the promises they'd carved into its bark as children. Those promises still mattered to her, even if they no longer did to him with each step. Through the snow, her determination solidified. She'd face him, demand the truth, and reclaim the family she'd spent a lifetime building, or watch it crumble under the weight of his betrayal. Jordan stood in her kitchen, the morning light filtering through the wide windows, casting long shadows across the marble countertop. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the crumpled letter she'd found tucked into a stack of mail on the entryway table. It wasn't addressed to her, technically. It wasn't even hers to open, but the familiar handwriting of her mother had caught her eye, and curiosity had overridden her better judgment. The words on the page hit her like a punch to the chest: the family's annual winter. Gathering, the one she'd been looking forward to as a chance to mend the growing cracks, had been moved from their parents' home to an upscale lodge in the Cascades. A private, luxurious retreat with hot springs and catered meals planned in secret, and nowhere in the detailed itinerary penned with her mother's meticulous care was there mention of Jordan's name. She read it again, her breath shallow, hoping she'd misunderstood, but the exclusion was undeniable. Dates, times, room assignments for Mason, Dylan, her parents, even a cousin she hadn't seen in years, everyone but her. The letter slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the floor as she gripped the edge of the counter, her mind racing. How long had they been planning this? Had they sat around a table, laughing over wine, deciding she didn't belong? The betrayal stung deeper than she'd expected, a raw ache that spread from her chest to her fingertips. She'd spent years holding the family together, bending over backward to accommodate everyone's needs. And this was her reward, a deliberate snub hidden behind smiles and silence. The sound of laughter drifted up from the guest suite downstairs, pulling her back to the present. Mason and Dylan were awake, their voices carrying through the house with a carefree ease that grated on her nerves. She descended the stairs, her footsteps heavy, the letter burning a hole in her pocket. The door to their space was ajar, and she pushed it open without knocking. Inside, the room was a mess. Empty beer cans on the coffee table, a half-eaten pizza on the counter, and a scattering of clothes across the floor. Mason lounged on the couch, phone in hand, while Dylan sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching on a tablet. They barely looked up as she entered. "Did you know about this?" Jordan's voice was tight, barely controlled as she held up the letter, her eyes locked on Mason, searching for any flicker of guilt. He glanced at the paper, then shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Now about what you snooping through Mom's mail. Now, don't play dumb," she snapped, her patience fraying. "The winter gathering, the lodge, the fact that I'm not invited." "Did you know?" Mason sighed, setting his phone down with an exaggerated slowness that felt like a taunt. "Look, George, it's not a big deal. Mom and Dad wanted something different this year, smaller, less drama. You've been intense lately. They thought it'd be better this way. Her heart lurched at the word intense. It was a dagger, sharp and precise, meant to wound intense. I've been holding this family together while you've been, living off me for 3 years without a shred of gratitude. And now I'm the problem. Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. But he said nothing, Mason, though leaned forward, his jaw tightening. Don't start with that again. Nobody asked you to play martyr. You offered to help, and now you act like we owe you our lives. Maybe if you weren't so controlling, always making everything about you, they wouldn't have felt the need to leave you out. The accusation landed like a slap, controlling. She'd spent her life building structures, literal and emotional, for the people she loved, and now she was domineering. Her voice rose despite herself, making everything about me. Mason, I've given you a home, paid your bills, bit my tongue every time you've disrespected my space, and you have the nerve to say, I'm the issue. He stood crossing his arms, his eyes cold. Yeah, I do. You hover, Jordan. You act like we're kids who need your permission to breathe. Mom and Dad see it too. They're tired of walking on eggshells around you. We all are. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with unspoken grievances. She wanted to scream, to list every sacrifice she'd made, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back upstairs, the echo of Mason's words chasing her. She didn't stop until she reached her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Leaning against it, she pressed her palms to her eyes, trying to block out the sting of tears. How had it come to this? How had her family turned her into the villain over the next few days? The tension in the house thickened. Like fog rolling in off the lake, Mason and Dylan's disregard for her boundaries became more brazen, as if the confrontation had given them license to push further. On Thursday evening, Jordan came home from a grueling day at the office to find her living room transformed into a makeshift party space. A dozen strangers milled about, drinks in hand, their laughter bouncing off the walls of her carefully curated home. Music blared from her high-end sound system, a playlist she didn't recognize. Empty chip bags and spilled soda stained her pristine rug, and someone had propped muddy boots on her glass coffee table. She stood frozen in the doorway, her keys still in hand as Mason waved at her from across the room with a grin that felt like a challenge. Hey, sis, didn't think you'd mind if we had a few friends over. You're never here anyway. He called out, his tone dripping with casual dismissal. Her blood boiled. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious glances, and grabbed Mason by the arm, pulling him into the kitchen. What is this? You didn't even ask. This is my house, Mason, my space. You can't just relax. He cut her off, pulling his arm free. It's just a get-together, like you're acting like I burned the place down. Why are you always so uptight? Uptight, another jab, another way to paint her as unreasonable. She clenched her fists, her voice low and trembling. I'm not uptight. I'm asking for basic respect, like clean this up, get these people out now. Mason rolled his eyes but didn't argue, turning back to the crowd with a shrug as if to say, see what I deal with. Dylan appeared at the kitchen doorway, his expression apologetic, but he offered no help, just a mumbled, sorry, Jordan. And before disappearing again, she stood there, surrounded by the chaos of her own home, feeling like an intruder in a life she'd built with such care. By the time the last guest stumbled out at midnight, leaving behind a trail of trash, her anger had curdled into exhaustion. She didn't bother speaking to Mason or Dylan as she dragged a garbage bag through the mess, her movements mechanical. What was the point? They'd already made up their minds about who she was desperate for perspective. Jordan met her closest friend Leah for coffee the next morning at a small cafe near her office. Leah, a non-nonsense therapist with a sharp wit, listened as Jordan poured out the story, the letter, the party, the accusations. The cafe buzzed around them, the clink of mugs and murmur of conversation, a stark contrast to the storm inside her. Leah set her latte down, her gaze steady and unflinching. Jordan, you've got to set boundaries, she said plainly. You've let them walk all over you for too long. Mason's not a kid anymore. He's a grown man taking advantage of your kindness and your parents. They're enabling it. You don't owe them your sanity just because they're family. Jordan stared into her coffee, the steam curling up like her tangled thoughts. I know you're right, but every time I try to push back, they twist it. They make me feel like I'm the selfish one, like I'm breaking the family apart if I don't keep giving." Leah leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "That's manipulation. Hun guilt is their weapon, and they know how to wield it. You're not responsible for their happiness. You've got to draw a line, even if it's messy. Tell Mason and Dylan they have a deadline to move out. Tell your parents you're done being the scapegoat. If they can't respect that, then they don't respect you." The advice lingered with Jordan as she drove home, her hands tight on the steering wheel. Leah's words made sense, but the thought of enforcing limits felt like stepping off a cliff. What if they called her bluff? What if she lost them for good? The fear gnawed at her, but so did the resentment, a heavy weight she could no longer ignore that evening. Her mother called Jordan, hesitated before answering her thumb, hovering over the screen when she finally picked up. Her mother's voice was warm but laced with something else. Reproach, perhaps, or disappointment, Jordan, sweetheart. "We need to talk about the gathering. I know you found the letter. I wish you hadn't. But since you did, let's clear the air." Jordan's stomach churned. "Clear the air, Mom. You planned a family trip without me. How am I supposed to feel about that?" Her mother sighed, a sound that carried years of unspoken tension. "It wasn't meant to hurt you. We just thought, well, things have been strained. You've been so hard on Mason lately, and he's struggling. We wanted a peaceful trip just this once. You always make everything so complicated, pushing everyone to meet your standards. We needed a break." The words echoed Mason's earlier accusations, and Jordan felt the ground shift beneath her. "A break from me. Mom, I've done everything for this family. I've supported Mason, hosted everyone, kept us together, and now I'm the one who's too much. You're not listening." Her mother pressed her tone, sharpening. "You take over, Jordan. You decide how things should be, and if they're not, you get upset." Mason feels suffocated. We all do sometimes. Can't you see how your need to control everything pushes us away? Jordan gripped the phone, her knuckles white. The guilt crept in, insidious and familiar, whispering that maybe they were right. Maybe she was too rigid, too demanding, but beneath it a spark of defiance flared. She wasn't the problem. She'd given too much. "Not too little, Mom. I'm not controlling. I'm trying to hold us together. If that's a crime, then I'm sorry. But I deserve better than being cut out of my own family." The conversation ended with a strange silence, her mother murmuring a goodbye that felt like a dismissal. Jordan sat on her couch, the house quiet for once, and stared at the lake beyond her window. The water was still a mirror reflecting the gray sky, and she wondered if her reflection in their eyes was as distorted as they claimed. Mason's laughter echoed from downstairs. Again, another gathering. She hadn't been told about another violation of her space. She didn't move to confront him. This time, instead, she pulled out her laptop and began drafting an email of formal notice to Mason and Dylan, giving them 60 days to find their own place. Her fingers hesitated over the send button, Leah's words battling her mother's in her mind. The winter gathering was in 3 days. 3 days until she'd face them all at her parents' house. Assuming they didn't resend that invitation too, she didn't know if she'd send the email before then, or if she'd have the courage to stand her ground in person. But as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the lake in shades of amber and shadow, she knew. One thing for certain, she couldn't keep living like this, a pillar for everyone else, while her own foundation crumbled. Family was worth fighting for, but not at the cost of herself. Whatever happened next, whether it was reconciliation or rupture, she'd face it head on, no longer content to be the silent architect of their happiness. While they tore down hers brick by brick, Jordan returned home on the eve of the winter gathering, the weight of the past week pressing down on her like a storm cloud ready to break. The drive had been long, her thoughts a tangled mess of Leah's advice and her mother's cutting words. She'd spent the day at the office trying to focus on spreadsheets and client calls, but her mind kept drifting back to the lake house, to the unspoken rules she'd let govern her life for too long. As she pulled into the driveway, the sight of extra cars parked haphazardly along the curb made her stomach twist. Lights blazed from every window of her home, and the faint thrum of music pulsed. Through the evening air, she didn't need to step inside to know what she'd find, but the reality still hit her like a brick. When she opened the front door, the living room was packed a sea of unfamiliar faces, mingling with a few she vaguely recognized from Mason Circle balloons bobbed against the ceiling, their metallic surfaces catching the light with garish cheer, and a hand-painted banner stretched across the archway to the dining room Bon Voyage winter crew. It read in bold, sloppy letters as if this were some grand send-off for a joyous adventure, a farewell party for the family trip, the one she hadn't been invited to right here in her own house. The audacity of it stole her breath. Empty cups littered her coffee table, sticky rings marking the wood she'd spent hours polishing. Someone had dragged her dining chairs into a haphazard circle for a game of cards, and the smell of cheap beer and burnt popcorn clung to the air. Laughter erupted from the kitchen, and she caught sight of Dylan. Through the crowd, a beer in hand, grinning as if this were his home, to commandeer Jordan stood frozen in the entryway, her work bag still slung over her shoulder, her keys biting into her palm. The noise and chaos swirled around her, a mockery of the sanctuary she'd built. This wasn't just a party, it was a statement, a final slap in the face before they all left for their exclusive retreat. Without her, she scanned the room for Mason, her pulse hammering in her ears, and spotted him near the patio doors, holding court with a group of friends. His laughter cut through the den, carefree and sharp, and when his eyes met hers, there was no guilt, no hesitation, just a flicker of defiance. As if daring her to react, she dropped her bag with a thud and pushed through the crowd, ignoring the curious stares and mumbled hellos. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, but her voice, when she reached Mason, was eerily calm, a thin veneer over the rage boiling beneath. "What is this, Mason, Farewell party in my house for a trip I'm not even part of." He turned to her slowly, his grin fading into something harder, more calculated. "Yeah, it's a little celebration before we head out tomorrow. Didn't think you'd care, since you know you're not coming. Figured you'd be at work anyway." His tone was casual, dismissive, as if her presence in her own home was an afterthought. The words sliced through her, each one a fresh wound. "Didn't think I'd care. Mason, this is my house, my space. You don't get to throw parties without asking, especially not for something like this. Do you even hear how cruel that is?" He shrugged, taking a sip from his drink, his nonchalance a weapon in itself, cruel. "Come on, It's not about you. We just wanted to have some fun before the trip. You're making it a bigger deal than it needs to be, like always." The crowd around them had quieted, sensing the tension, and Jordan felt their eyes on her, judging, waiting for her to explode or crumble. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of either. Instead, she straightened her voice, dropping to a dangerous whisper. "No, Mason, I'm done. I'm done with you treating my home like a free-for-all. I'm done with you and Dylan acting like I owe you everything while you spit in my face. This ends now. I want everyone out, and I want you and Dylan out of my house for good. You've got 30 days to find somewhere else to live." Mason's expression shifted, the cocky edge replaced by something darker, a mix of shock and anger. "You're kicking us out over a party. Are you serious right now?" "I'm dead serious," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've given you a place to stay for years. I've paid your bills, cleaned up your messes, and taken every insult you've thrown at me. But this is the last straw. You've crossed a line I can't ignore anymore." 30 days, that's it." Dylan appeared at Mason's side, his face pale, his usual quiet demeanor fraying at the edges. "Jordan, wait, we didn't mean to upset you. We just thought it's just a party." "Can't we talk about this?" "There's nothing to talk about," she snapped, turning her gaze on him. "You've both made it clear what you think of me. You've used my home, my generosity, and now you're throwing a celebration for a family event I'm excluded from, right? Under my roof. I'm not your doormat. Get your friends out of here now." Mason stepped closer, his voice low and venomous. "You're unbelievable. You know that. You act like you're some saint, like we should kiss the ground you walk on 'cause you let us crash here. But you're not a hero, Jordan. You're selfish. You hold this over our heads like a debt we can never repay. And then you wonder why nobody wants you around. Why do you think Mom and Dad didn't invite you? Because you suck the life out of everything. You're not family, you're a burden. The accusation hit her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt the weight of every sacrifice, every late night worrying over bills, every forced smile at family dinners crashed down on her. But beneath the hurt something else, stirred a cold, resolute anger that refused to let his words define her, a burden. She repeated, her voice shaking but firm. "I've carried this family for years, Mason. I've been there when you had nothing, when you couldn't even bother to say thank you if I'm a burden. Then why have you been so comfortable living off me if I'm so awful? Why are you still here?" Mason's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing, but he had no answer. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating, broken only by the murmur of the crowd still lingering nearby. Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his hands stuffed in his pockets, his gaze darting between them. "Jordan, please." He started, his voice soft, almost pleading. "We're sorry. We didn't think it would hurt you like this. Let's just calm down and let's—" "No," she cut him off, her tone final. "I'm done calming down. I've spent my life smoothing things over, pretending everything's fine while you all walk over me. Not anymore. You've got 30 days, start packing, start looking for a place because I'm not doing this another second, and get these people out of my house before I call the police to do it for you." Mason laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that grated on her nerves. "You're bluffing. You wouldn't throw us out. You don't have it in you. You're too scared of being alone, of losing what little family you've got left. Go ahead, play tough. But we both know you'll cave. You always do," his words. Stung, tapping into a fear she'd buried deep. The fear of isolation, of being the one left behind. For a moment, doubt flickered, her resolve wavering under the weight of his certainty. But then she thought of Leia's words, of the letter of the banner mocking her from across the room. She thought of the countless nights she'd lain awake wondering how to fix things, how to make them see her worth. She was tired of begging for scraps of respect. "Try me," she said, her voice a quiet steel. "I've given you everything, Mason. I've got nothing left to lose. Get out of my sight and take your party with you." She turned away before he could respond, her legs trembling as she moved toward the staircase. The crowd parted for her, their whispers a dull hum in her ears. She didn't look back, didn't give Mason the satisfaction of seeing the tears burning behind her eyes upstairs. She locked her bedroom door and sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her face. The music downstairs cut off, abruptly replaced by the shuffle of feet and the murmur of voices as people began to leave. She heard Mason's raised voice, sharp with frustration, barking orders to clean up, but she didn't care to decipher the words. Her chest ached, a hollow pain that pulsed with every breath. But there was something else there too, a strange, fragile relief, like the first gasp of air after being underwater too long. She stayed there, perched on the bed, as the house slowly emptied. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards as Mason or Dylan moved. Downstairs, exhaustion seeped into her bones, her body heavy with the emotional toll of the night. She wanted to collapse, to let sleep erase the raw edges of her anger and hurt, but she couldn't not yet. There was too much at stake. Too much left unresolved. She pulled her laptop from her nightstand with unsteady hands and opened the draft of the email she'd written days ago. The formal notice giving Mason and Dylan 60 days to move out. She stared at the words, her finger hovering over the send button. 30 days, she'd said downstairs, cutting her original timeline in half in the heat of the moment. Could she follow through? Could she really sever that tie, knowing it might mean losing them forever? The doubt noted at her. But so did the memory of Mason's sneer, of the banner, of her mother's voice on the phone telling her she was too much. She thought of the winter gathering happening tomorrow, of her family toasting to their peaceful trip, while she sat alone in a house that no longer felt like hers. Resentment flared again, hot and unyielding, and with it came a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just fighting for her space. She was fighting for herself, for the right to exist without apology in a family that had taken her for granted. She adjusted the email, changing the deadline to 30 days as she declared and hit send. Before she could second guess herself, the confirmation chime felt like a gavel, falling final and irreversible downstairs. The last of the mess was being cleared. Or so she hoped. She didn't have the energy to check, didn't have the strength to face another round of accusations or guilt trips. Instead, she lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the confrontation in vivid, painful detail. Mason's words echoed selfish burdens suffocating, and she wondered, not for the first time, if there was truth in them. Had she pushed too hard, expected too much, or had she simply asked for the bare minimum, a respect they'd never been willing to give? The questions churned, but no answers came. Just the steady tick of the clock on her nightstand marking the hours until morning tomorrow. She'd face her parents. Assuming they didn't cancel her visit altogether tomorrow, she'd walk into their house with her head held high. Even if her heart was in pieces, she didn't know if the email would be the end of her relationship with Mason and Dylan, or if her stand tonight would force them to see her differently. She didn't know if her family could be salvaged, or if she'd spend the rest of her life rebuilding from the rubble of their rejection. But as she closed her eyes, the weight of her decision settling over her like a blanket, she knew one thing she'd chosen: action over compromise, and whatever came next, she'd face it on her own terms for the first time in years. That felt like enough. The morning after the confrontation dawned cold and gray, the sky outside Jordan's window a mirror to the heaviness in her chest. She hadn't slept much, her mind caught in a loop of Mason's venomous words, and the finality of the email she'd sent the house was eerily quiet as she descended the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. The living room bore the scars of last night's party, faint stains on the carpet, a forgotten cup under the couch. But the worst of the mess had been cleared. She didn't know if Mason or Dylan had done it, and she didn't care to ask. The silence felt like a temporary truce, fragile and fleeting. She was halfway through brewing coffee when the front door creaked open and Mason stepped inside, his face a mask of forced humility. Dylan trailed behind his eyes, downcast hands fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. Jordan's grip tightened on the coffee pot, her body bracing for another fight, but Mason raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Look, George, we need to talk," he said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "We messed up last night, big time. And we're sorry, but there's something you need to know before you go through with, kicking us out." Jordan set the pot down with a deliberate clink, her expression unreadable. "I'm listening, but don't waste my time with excuses. I meant what I said." Mason exchanged a glance with Dylan, who nodded slightly as if giving permission to proceed. "It's not an excuse," Mason continued, his tone shifting to something almost desperate. "It's serious, Dylan and his girlfriend. They're expecting a baby. They just found out last week. We didn't want to say anything until it was certain, but now it is. They need a stable place to stay, Jordan. You can't just throw them out knowing that we're family." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and for a moment Jordan felt a pang of doubt pierce her resolve. A baby. The weight of that responsibility, the image of Dylan as a father stirred something protective in her, a reflex born from years of putting others first. She looked at Dylan, searching his face for confirmation, but his gaze remained fixed on the floor, his silence unnerving. "Is this true?" she asked her, voice quieter now, almost gentle. "You're going to be a dad." Dylan nodded, a quick jerky motion, but he didn't meet her eyes. "Yeah, it's early, but we're trying to figure things out." Jordan leaned against the counter, her mind racing. The timing felt too convenient, the story too perfectly crafted to tug at her heartstrings. By Shelton, she wanted to believe them, to trust that this was genuine, but the memory of last night's cruelty lingered like a bad taste. "I'm happy for you if it's true," she said carefully, watching their reactions. "But this doesn't change what I said. You've got 30 days. I can help with resources, point you to affordable housing, but I'm not backing down. My home isn't a revolving door for you to come and go as you please." Mason's face darkened, his attempt at sincerity crumbling. "You're really going to do this, even with a kid on the way? What kind of person are you, Jordan? You're heartless." The accusation stung, but she held her ground, her voice steady. "Don't turn this on me. I've done enough. You've had years to figure out your lives, and I've carried you both. This isn't about a baby, it's about respect, and you've shown me none." Their argument was cut short by the buzz of her phone on the counter. She ignored it, but the seed of suspicion had already taken root over the next few hours. While Mason and Dylan retreated to their rooms, Jordan did what she hadn't in years. She dug deeper, a few discreet calls to mutual acquaintances, a scroll through social media, and a conversation with Dylan's supposed girlfriend's cousin revealed the truth. There was no pregnancy, no doctor visits, no excited announcements, nothing. It was a lie, a desperate fabrication to guilt. Her into relenting, worse. She learned her mother had known about the plan, had even suggested it during a late-night call with Mason, encouraging him to play the sympathy card to keep their arrangement intact. The betrayal cut deeper than the party. Sharper than Mason's words, Jordan sat at her kitchen table staring at the evidence on her laptop screen, her hands trembling with a mix of anger and grief, her own family conspiring to manipulate her to keep her tethered to their needs while dismissing her own. She felt foolish for almost believing them, for letting that flicker of hope cloud her judgment. But the hurt fueled her determination. She wouldn't let them win. By afternoon, word of the fallout had spread through the extended family, carried by whispers and hurried texts. Her phone buzzed again, this time with messages from cousins and an aunt she hadn't spoken to in months. Some sided with Mason, accusing her of overreacting, of tearing the family apart over a silly misunderstanding, but others surprised her. Her cousin Ellie texted first, her words raw and honest. "I've seen how they treat you. George always have. You're not wrong to stand up for yourself. Mom and Dad did the same to me years ago, excluded me from everything, made me feel like I didn't belong. I'm sorry. I didn't say anything sooner." Another message from her Uncle Tim echoed a similar sentiment, revealing how he'd been sidelined at family events. His opinions dismissed his presence, tolerated rather, then welcomed. Their words were a bittersweet comfort, a validation of the pain she'd buried for so long. Jordan read and reread the messages, her throat tight with unshed tears. She wasn't alone in feeling like an outsider in wrestling with the unspoken rules that dictated who was in and who was out. The family patterns of exclusion stretched further back than she'd realized, a legacy of favoritism and control she hadn't fully seen until now. It didn't erase the ache of her parents' rejection or Mason's betrayal, but it gave her a strange sense of solidarity, a reminder that her fight wasn't just personal. It was a break from a cycle that had hurt others too. As evening fell, Jordan sat on her porch, wrapped in a blanket against the chill, her phone silent at last. The messages from Ellie and Tim played in her mind, mingling with the sting of her mother's complicity in the lie. She knew the road ahead would be brutal, facing her parents at the gathering, enforcing the eviction, navigating the fractured remains of her family ties. But for the first time, she felt a quiet strength beneath the uncertainty. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for her place, for the right to be seen as more than a convenience. And though the battle was far from over, the support of a few, the truth laid bare, gave her the resolve to keep going. No matter who stood against her, the days following Jordan's discovery of the lie were a blur of resolve and quiet action. She didn't confront Mason or Dylan, immediately choosing instead to channel her energy into the formal eviction process with a heavy heart. But a steady hand, she printed out the necessary paperwork, her fingers trembling only slightly as she signed her name. She sought advice from a local legal aid office, ensuring every step was by the book. The weight of it all pressed on her, but she wasn't alone. Her cousin Ellie checked in daily, offering a listening ear, while her Aunt Lydia, a woman who had always been on the fringes of family drama, surprised her with a late-night call. Lydia's voice was warm, weathered by years of navigating similar betrayals. "You're doing the right thing, Jordan," she said. "I know it feels like you're breaking something, but sometimes you have to tear down the old to build something better. I've been there, cut off by your grandparents for marrying outside their expectations. It hurts, but it frees you too." Lydia's perspective, raw and unfiltered, grounded Jordan in a way she hadn't expected. It wasn't just her fight. It was a shared history of standing up against unfair family tides. As November bled into December, Jordan leaned into her chosen family. She spent the holidays not with her parents or siblings, but with friends who had become her anchors over the years. Her best friend, Carrara, hosted a small Thanksgiving dinner, the table crowded with mismatched chairs and laughter that felt like a balm. They didn't talk much about the eviction or the family fallout, but Kara's knowing glances and the way she squeezed Jordan's hand said enough on Christmas Eve. Jordan joined a community volunteering event at the local shelter, serving meals alongside strangers, who quickly became familiar faces. The act of giving, of focusing on others, eased the ache in her chest. If only for a few hours, she also started therapy, a decision she'd put off for years, sitting across from a kind-eyed counselor in a small, softly lit office. Jordan began to unpack the layers of guilt and obligation that had shaped so much of her life. Each session was a step toward understanding why she'd carried so much for so long, and though the process was slow, it felt like reclaiming pieces of herself she'd forgotten existed. By mid-December, the eviction process reached its inevitable conclusion. Mason and Dylan moved out on a frigid morning, their belongings packed into a rented truck. Jordan stood by the front door, arms crossed her face, a mask of neutrality. As they loaded the last boxes, Mason shot her a glare, muttering something under his breath. But Dylan avoided her gaze entirely, his shoulders hunched as if carrying more than just cardboard. She didn't offer help, didn't soften the moment with words. When the truck pulled away, the silence that settled over the house was different this time. Not tense, but empty in a way that felt like a blank slate. She walked through the now vacant rooms, the echoes of their presence lingering in scuffed walls and faint smells of cigarette smoke. But instead of sadness, she felt a flicker of possibility. This was her space again. Hers to redefine. Her relationship with her parents remained a delicate thread, strained but not entirely severed. They hadn't spoken since the fallout, though her mother sent a curt wishing her a peaceful holiday. Jordan read it with a bitter taste in her mouth, knowing the words were more formality than feeling. When she ran into her father at the grocery store a few days before Christmas, the encounter was brief. Civil and hollow, he nodded, mumbled a hello, and moved past her in the aisle as if she were a stranger. It stung, but Jordan didn't chase after him. She'd spent too long chasing approval that never came instead. She focused on the small, steady connection she was building elsewhere. Aunt Lydia invited her over for a quiet New Year's Eve. Just the two of them, sipping tea by a crackling fire. Lydia shared stories of her own estrangement, of rebuilding a life outside the family's narrow expectations. And Jordan listened, absorbing the quiet strength in her aunt's words. It wasn't a replacement for what she lost, but it was a start. With Mason and Dylan gone, Jordan set out to reclaim her home in ways both literal and symbolic. She spent a weekend deep cleaning every corner, scrubbing away the last traces of their chaos. She rearranged the living room, moving the couch to face the window where morning light poured in, and hung a few framed photos of her travels, moments of joy she'd captured before family. Burdens had taken over. She started small traditions, ones that belonged to her alone. On Sunday mornings, she'd brew a pot of coffee and sit on the porch with a book, wrapped in the same blanket she'd used during those late-night moments of doubt. She invited Carrara and a few other friends over for a housewarming of sorts, not to celebrate a new place, but a new chapter they cooked together in her kitchen. The air filled with the scent of garlic and rosemary, and for the first time in months, the house felt alive with something other than tension. Beyond her home, Jordan began to weave herself into the fabric of her community. Volunteering at the shelter became a regular commitment, a way to ground herself in purpose. She met people there who had their own stories of loss and resilience, and their quiet camaraderie reminded her that family wasn't just blood, it was the connections you nurtured. She also joined a local book club, a small group that met at a cozy cafe every other week. The discussions, often meandering from literature to life, gave her a space to share without judgment, to laugh without reservation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she felt herself softening, the sharp edges of her anger dulling into something more manageable. Therapy helped with that too. Her counselor encouraged her to write letters. She'd never send one to her parents. One to Mason, even one to herself, pouring her hurt and hopes onto the page was cathartic, a way to release what she couldn't say aloud as winter deepened. Jordan found herself reflecting on the past year with a clarity she hadn't had before the betrayal, the lies, the family dynamics she'd once accepted as normal. They all looked different now, like a puzzle. She was finally piecing together. She saw how much of herself she'd given away, how often she'd shrunk to fit others' needs. But she also saw her strength, the courage it took to draw a line and hold it even when it meant standing alone. The messages from Ellie and Uncle Tim tucked away in her phone were reminders that she wasn't entirely isolated, that others had walked this path and survived their support, alongside Lydia's wisdom, and her friend's unwavering presence became the foundation she built on one. Evening in late January, Jordan stood in her kitchen, a mug of tea warming her hands as she looked out at the snow-dusted yard. The house was quiet, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet, not the oppressive silence of unspoken resentment. She thought about the holidays just past, the meals shared with friends, the laughter at the shelter, the late-night talks with Lydia. She thought about the therapy sessions, the slow unraveling of old wounds and the small victories of setting boundaries. Her life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of loneliness, still unanswered questions about whether her parents would ever truly see her. But it was hers more authentically than it had ever been. She'd started traditions that felt right, built connections that nourished rather than drained her, and reclaimed a home that was once a battleground as she sipped her tea. Jordan felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The road ahead would have its challenges, family gatherings she might skip, conversations that might never heal, but she was no longer tethered to the old patterns, no longer defined by others' expectations. She was building something new brick by brick, and though the process was messy and imperfect, it was hers to shape. For the first time in a long time that felt like enough, Jordan sat at her kitchen table one chilly evening in late January, a notebook open in front of her, the pages filled with scribbled thoughts from the past few weeks. The steam from her tea curled upward, mingling with the soft glow of the overhead light, and she felt a need to distill the lessons she'd learned through the turbulence of the past year. Setting boundaries, she wrote, wasn't just about pushing people away. It was about protecting her own peace, creating space for growth, even with family, especially with family. Those lines had to be drawn. She'd spent so much of her life bending to their expectations, swallowing her own needs to keep the peace. But at what cost? The betrayal with Mason and Dylan had been the breaking point, the moment she realized that love shouldn't come with endless sacrifice. Personal growth, she mused, started with saying no, with recognizing that she deserved respect as much as anyone else. She paused pen, hovering over the page as memories of her parents' coldness and her siblings' entitlement flashed through her mind. Blood tied them together, but it didn't guarantee mutual care or understanding. True family, she concluded, wasn't defined by shared DNA, but by the presence of support, by those who lifted her up instead of weighing her down. Tarara. Ellie's quiet strength during the holidays, Ellie's daily texts, Lydia's hard-earned wisdom, these were the threads that woo her new sense of belonging. Even the strangers at the shelter with their shared smiles over steaming trays of food had shown her more kindness in a few hours than some relatives had in years. Family, she wrote, was a choice, a garden you tended with trust and reciprocity, not an obligation you endured as she sipped her tea. Jordan felt a stirring to connect beyond her own story. She wanted to hear from others who'd walked similar paths, who'd faced the hard choice of redefining relationships for their own well-being. What had they learned from setting boundaries with loved ones? How had they rebuilt after cutting ties or stepping back? She imagined sitting in a circle at the book club or the shelter, passing around a metaphorical talking stick, each person sharing their triumphs and scars. Her own journey had been isolating at times, but she knew she wasn't alone in it. There was strength and shared experience in knowing that others had navigated the guilt, the doubt, and come out stronger. She jotted down a final note, an invitation of sorts to listen to. learned to build a community of understanding her home was hers again, but her heart was open to stories that echoed her own, to connections that could teach her even more about resilience and redefining what family truly meant.